How's it going, everybody? I thought with the CFL completely screwing up the All-Star teams for this season, I figured I would create my own list of who I would vote CFL All-Stars if it was up to me. So, with that in mind, let's get started with today's video. And trying out something new. Going to do a lot of Excel going forward. I think with some of the graphics, I'll have this way I can show off a lot more like statistics and stuff. So hopefully a lot of the stuff in this video is readable for everybody. But they're just trying out new ways of presenting the videos to everyone who watches this channel. So first off, for the criteria I use to select the players for this list, obviously it's all about the 2022 season, your past accolades, or the last 3 years of your play. Doesn't really matter. It just matters how they played this season. So this is not necessarily like a player rankings list, because there are players that did not make this list that I would consider the best at their position in the CFL. But this is a reflection of who was outstanding this season, and let's get on with the list. So I'm just going to show a few at a time here, just so we can get a clear view of everything on the screen. So I'm going to walk through position by position. Before we get started, though, with the positional designations, I decided to, for example, offensive line, it's not left tackle and right tackle. I just decided to pick two tackles regardless of what side they play, just to make it easier from that sense. And then same thing with the defensive backs. The receivers, no designation about which position that they line up on. So with that in mind, let's get started with my quarterback. So I went with Zach Collaros of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. As you can see, these are his stats this season. 37 touchdowns stands out. That's a career high for him. 13 interceptions, 116 passer rating, and 9.6 yards per attempt, which is a stat that I really like to use to evaluate high-level quarterback play. I think Zach Collaros is playing as well as he ever has in the CFL, right up there with how he played back in 2015 with Hamilton, whatever that year was where they got off to that really amazing start. He's just taken his game to a whole new level, especially in terms of that improvisational ability. It's been a real difference maker for the Blue Bombers the last 3 years here. And, people will say Nathan Rourke in this spot, but I just have to put a guy that played the majority of the season. We got to give some love to Zach Collaros. He's playing amazing football right now, and he would be my CFL All-Star selection at quarterback. Then moving on to running back, I went with Kadeem Carey of the Calgary Stampeders. Only the 14 games played this year, but he still led the league in rushing, averaged 6.6 yards per carry, 10 touchdowns, added some yards here on the ground. But honestly, he was the biggest difference maker at running back this season. And, I just watched on the weekend the playoff game. He was a little quiet in that one, but, overall on the year, he was amazing and was the driving force of the Calgary Stampeders. And probably a big reason why BC won that game on the weekend is because they were able to slow down Kadeem Carey. And then in the receiving core, probably the hardest position to rank and, narrow it down to 5 guys that I would select. But the first guy you have to put up there is Dalton Schoen, who is a rookie sensation for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and he was outstanding. 70 catches on the year on 108 targets, first in receiving yards with 16 touchdowns, was also led the league. This guy's going to go to the NFL next year. I think, it wouldn't surprise me one bit if he's a guy that makes an impact in the NFL in the next couple of years. And then the second guy I went with was Eugene Lewis for the Montreal Alouettes. Again, a no-brainer. I think he is the best receiver overall in the CFL today. He was just so dynamic for this Alouettes offense that desperately needed him on a week-to-week basis. Second in the CFL in receptions. Very high in terms of the targets, but that's because I think he was really the true difference maker on that offense. Guys like Jake Wieneke took a step back this year. and Eugene Lewis picked up the slack like he's been doing the last couple of seasons in Montreal. And then the third receiver I went with was Dominic Rhymes of the BC Lions. Had a big catch on the weekend there in the playoffs, but outstanding season from him. Very underrated player when back in 2019 with the Red Blacks put up 1,000 yards with terrible quarterback play. Now he's had outstanding quarterback play with the BC Lions this season, and you see the results here with the great numbers. Second in the league in receiving yards, second in the league in receiving touchdowns. Incredible season for Rhymes. And then I went with Tim White of the Hamilton Tiger Cats. Really the only true difference maker, I think, on that offense this year. I think he's a much better player than Stephen Dunbar, for example, who also went over 1,000 yards this year for Hamilton. But I think Tim White, really the dangerous guy for that offense, vertical threat, kind of that do-it-all, guy in the short game as well. So impressive year for him. Led the league in receptions. Also tied for the lead in targets with Eugene Lewis. So big year for Tim White, and really was their most outstanding player in 2022. And then the really tough decision was the fifth receiver I went with here, and I went with Malik Henry of the Calgary Stampeders, who only played 13 games this year, so his stats aren't going to look as good as these guys right here. But, honestly, he was such a difference maker for the Calgary Stampeders when he was in the lineup this year. Again, the 5 missed games, but look at the numbers. Despite missing those games, still went over 1,000 yards, 8 touchdowns. I think he was one of the top 5 receivers in the league this year, and outplayed guys like Reggie Bagleton and Kamar Jordan, who were on the same team. Now moving on to the offensive line here, and obviously not as much stats available for offensive linemen, but I'll give a little bit of reasoning why these players I selected for this list. So at tackle, I went with Stanley Bryant for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Just the best offensive lineman in the CFL, future Hall of Famer. Not much else you can say about him. He's probably going to win most outstanding offensive lineman again this season. And, he was just a, stalwart again for the Bombers this year. Second least sacks allowed in the league for that offensive line. Played 17 games, only missing the 1. So impressive year once again for Stanley Bryant. Once again for Brandon Revenberg as well at guard for Hamilton. Basically the only constant on that Tiger Cats offensive line the entire season. Only missed the 1 game. I believe that was the first game he missed in his entire CFL career. Just such a consistent player for the Tiger Cats on otherwise is a pretty shaky offensive line for the majority of the season this year. And then Sean McEwen for the Calgary Stampeders. Really tough position to sort out this year in the CFL because most teams' centers got hurt this season at some point. So, not many guys played like 16, 17 games. But Sean McEwen played 12 games. I think he's the best center in the league when healthy. Calgary offensive line, and I'll say it, down here as well for Derek Dennis. But least sacks allowed in the league and rushed for the most yards per carry. Best rushing team in the league this season. So, Sean McEwen, I think, is the best center in the league today and was for the times that he was on the field this season. And then at guard for my other selection here, I went with Suk Chung of the BC Lions. I mean, I think this is a guy that, back in 2019, I believe is the year that they signed him away from the Blue Bombers. This is a guy that they expected to be one of the best offensive linemen in the CFL and be an anchor for that team. And he was just playing so poorly those first couple of years for BC that, it didn't look like it was going to turn around, but they were still relying on him to be a big part of that offensive line going into this season. And I think he's looked so much better, had a bounce back year. This is a guy that has been an all-star in the past in the CFL back to his time with Winnipeg. So, I think the Lions had the single most improved positional group, which is their offensive line in my eyes throughout the entire season, throughout the entire league. So that is why I'm picking Suk Chung to represent them on my all-star team. Really struggled with who I was going to put here, but I'm going to go with Suk Chung of the BC Lions. And then my last tackle here is Derek Dennis of the Calgary Stampeders, a guy that got injured with 4 games to go in the season, but he returned to the field after missing all of last season due to a contract dispute with the Edmonton Elks. Didn't play since 2019 because of that lost season in 2020, but returned to the field this year and resumed his high level of play and was probably going to win the most outstanding offensive lineman if he, finished out the season there without getting injured. But, I think, as a result of his injury, it's probably going to go to Bryant again. But anyway, that is the offensive line and the entire offense. Now moving on to the defense here. And starting with the defensive line, going with Lorenzo Malden and Sean Lemon here of the Ottawa Red Blacks and Calgary Stampeders, respectively. Malden for the Red Blacks, 18 games played, 17 sacks, 43 tackles, 2 forced fumbles, and 2 fumble recoveries. Just a truly incredible breakout season for him. Kind of an off-the-radar signing by former Tiger Cats assistant general manager Sean Burke in the offseason. He's played amazing for that defense. It was really the big bright spot of this team this year. And then Sean Lemon for the Calgary Stampeders. Lingered out there on the free agent market for a while, but Calgary decided to bring him back, and they're glad that they did. 14 sacks, 5 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries. Just a lot of impactful plays for Sean Lemon. I don't think, like I said, this is a case of this all-star team. Not everybody on this list is the best player, I think, at their respective position. I don't think Sean Lemon is even probably a top 3 defensive end in the league, but he played like it this year and was a very impactful guy for the Calgary Stampeders. And then talking about the Calgary Stampeders again, here are Mike Rose at defensive tackle. I think he's the most impactful defensive tackle in the CFL today. Even had a big game, I think, against the Lions on the weekend, the playoffs there, despite the loss. And then I had a really tough time with the second defensive tackle here, but a guy that really stood out here was Jake Serezna, who only played in the 12 games this year for the Edmonton Elks, but had 10 sacks, 31 tackles, and 4 forced fumbles. Incredible production for such a small time in the league this season, or only playing 2/3 of the CFL season this year. So incredible year for him, and I thought that he should represent the Elks on this list. And I just couldn't figure out anybody else that was more deserving for this second defensive tackle spot. And then moving on to the linebackers, an obvious choice here at weak side linebacker with Toronto Argonauts, Winton McManus, 14 games played, 95 tackles, 3 sacks, 2 INTs, 1 forced fumble, 1 defensive touchdown, and 1 pass defense this season. He was just simply a stat sheet stuffer and an incredible player for that Toronto defense. May have won Defensive Player of the Year in the CFL Most Outstanding Defensive Player in the entire league if he had finished out the season and had 18 games played worth of stats. And then Darnell Sankey for the Saskatchewan Roughriders set a team record for tackles, I do believe. A huge bright spot for that defense. An incredible middle linebacker his first couple years here in the CFL, just tackling machine. Makes some impactful plays in the passing game in terms of the 2 pass deflections here. So, incredible player for the Saskatchewan Roughriders, and otherwise was a very disappointing season. And then Cameron Kelly at the dime/strong side linebacker position of the Hamilton Tiger Cats. 18 games played, 51 tackles, 2 sacks, the 5 picks and 8 pass deflections. That is, some elite level production in that regard. Just a guy, again, that was all over the place this season and was just very noticeable for the Tiger Cats defense. And then looking at the defensive back room here, as we scroll down a little bit, we have Gary Peters and Jamal Peters, so 2 Peters here as my 2 cornerbacks. Gary Peters for the BC Lions, big bounce back year this year for him, in my opinion. And, takeaway numbers, 5 interceptions, 6 pass deflections, elite level productions. He's always kind of been that, very aggressive defensive back type. And, we saw that again on the weekend, had a great game against the Stampeders, and overall had a great season for the BC Lions. Then Jamal Peters, who got a lot of his picks and matchups against the Hamilton Tiger Cats. I believe 5 of the 6 interceptions this season came against the Hamilton Tiger Cats. But, overall, I think he was a very talented corner going into this season. And I think he's really put it together as the year's gone on. And I think the Toronto defense has been very impressive this year. And then in terms of the halfbacks, I went with Dietrich Nichols for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. I had him as my number one halfback in the CFL going into the season. Don't feel any differently now. Even though his production may not be the most amazing, only with the one interception the entire season, but the 8 pass deflections tell a different story there. Gets his hands in passing lanes. Not a lot of quarterbacks wanting to challenge him this season, looking in other directions on that Winnipeg defense. And then Richard Leonard for the Hamilton Tiger Cats, had a great second half of the season in particular, and I think had production worthy of being named to this list. And my final player here is Loucheiz Purifoy of the BC Lions here at safety. Another guy that's just super versatile, can play a little bit of a dime / strong side linebacker as well. Just been an incredibly important player to his team's defenses over the last couple of seasons. And I think this is why he's deserving of a spot on this All-Star team. Now finishing off this video with the special team selections, I went with a Calgary Stampeders kicking duo of Rene Paredes and Cody Grace. This is just based off a guy that I follow that does a really good breakdown of kickers. I'll link his website in the description actually for this video, but he does incredible breakdowns of the special teams rankings in the CFL. Blanking on his name right now, but I appreciate the work that he does, and he had the Calgary Stampeders as one of the best, or the best kicking teams in the CFL this season on, in terms of net average and in terms of place kicking as well. So I went with Rene Paredes and Cody Grace here. Outstanding players in the special teams aspect of the game. And then the tough selection here at kick returner / punt returner, I went with Mario Alford of the Saskatchewan Roughriders, but you could easily argue Chandler Worthy of the Montreal Alouettes, who had an outstanding season as well. Alford, of course, started the season on the Alouettes roster and then was traded mid-season. Just was a super impactful guy once he got to Saskatchewan. And, had great numbers here. 3 combined return touchdowns on the season for him. And an incredible season for him. And that's why he's worthy of being on this list. Now finishing out this video with the number of All-Star selections per team, per my selections for the All-Star team this year. The first place here is the Calgary Stampeders with 8 guys selected. I know they lost on the weekend, but I think they're just a very talented team on both sides of the ball, and they just happen to have players that had outstanding seasons at positions that didn't really have many other options. And they actually have double the second most teams here in the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, who only had 4 selections. In fact, Winnipeg, BC, Hamilton tied with 4 selections. A couple of close calls for Winnipeg, really close to putting Willie Jefferson on this list, despite having maybe not as many sacks or impactful plays as he had in recent years, or splash plays, if you will. But I think Winnipeg, they could have easily had 5 or 6 guys. I think just some really close decisions there. BC, same thing with them. I think they've had many guys that had deserving seasons of being All-Stars this year. Hamilton was a little surprised that it ended up having 4, just because of how bad their season was to start off this year. But ultimately, a few guys that were just really standing out compared to the respective players at their respective positions. And then here with Toronto and Saskatchewan, who both had 2. Toronto, I think they easily could have had a receiver. Curly Gittens could have made the list as well. But not a ton of outstanding players for this Toronto Argonauts. Just a very well-balanced roster, but not a ton of superstar performances this year from them. Saskatchewan, same with them as well. And then Montreal, Ottawa, and Edmonton, the lone 1 All-Stars for each of those 3 teams. So those are just my selections for the CFL All-Star team for 2022. Let me know in the comments section if you disagree with any of my selections. And I appreciate you guys for watching the video. Be sure to drop a like down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.